righty, it is 6 o'clock. You know what that means. It's time to start. Um, Let me get my slides in order and we will begin. Uh, Share screen and keynote. Bada bing, bada boom. Okay. Let me double check the YouTube stream to make sure that everything here is okay. We're working on like 3 different screens here, but we'll make it work. Okay, so I have a grand total of 5 people watching live between Zoom and YouTube. Okay, so I hope you guys are doing well or doing better than we were last time. I don't know if you guys had a chance to catch the freak random hurricane that we got in the middle of the day, because why not spice it up a little bit, make quarantine interesting. So today is going to be a course on Hitler himself, in that we will, after having discussed at length the dynamics in which the Weimar Republic finds itself in the aftermath of the war, now it's time to see how the Weimar Republic fails, how a democracy can collapse. And there's a lot to be mentioned here. There's a lot to be discussed here. Now, before I move on, I want to try something, and we're doing this live. I probably should have tested this before, but that would require me to make good decisions. And it's like, you've learned nothing from this class. So if I go full screen, okay. Let me know if you guys see a difference. Obviously, it's full screen, but hopefully the animations and the graphics and stuff should work better because of this. Okay, let's talk Nazis. So quickly, recapping Stalin, our last lecture. We said that Stalin comes to power after Lenin suffers a stroke at the end of the Russian Civil War, and that essentially the election, the campaign of who's going to replace Stalin coincides with the transition away from the war economy to the peacetime economy, because basically until 1922, Russia had spent the past 20 years of war. 10 years of war. They had never experienced a peacetime economy under the communist system. And so they were essentially arguing in the midst of this conference about the NEP, the new economic policy, what the future of Russia is going to look like, what the future of Russia is going to be. And Stalin's platform is about implementing what he calls socialism in one country, in that socialism needed to be perfected in Russia, not so much because Russia was in the best place to do it, but if Russia did not do it, it would be crushed, essentially, because all of the other countries of Europe had a really, really strong motivation to see Russia fail, to see Russia not succeed. Why? Think about it this way. Think about if you're Germany or if you're England, and you have you're dealing with socialists at home. And the longer Russia, the Soviet Union, exists, the longer there is this inspiration that these parties can look at, the more in peril you are. This goes against, rather forcefully, the ideas of Trotsky and Bukharin, his political rivals. If you remember at the NEP, Trotsky was all for going all over Europe and actively looking to topple these countries, the opposite take to what Stalin has, for the reason that socialism in Russia was not working because it wasn't designed to work that way. It was designed to work collaboratively, but Russia was not collaborating with anyone because they had no friends. And Bukharin's view was more to bring peasants into the fold, to have this sort of peasant-style communism. And his ideas would live on eventually through, something that we're not talking about in this class, but if you take a Worlds 2, you'll look at it, the Chinese Communist movement. Bukharin's ideas really transition into that context, and it's also why, parentheses, why during the 1960s and 70s you have the Great Schism, as it's called, between China and Russia. They start not getting along. Why? This is part of the reason. Part of the reason is strictly ideological. And so Stalin implements, according to the view we talked about in the hard line, this plan to rapidly sort of bring Russia into the 20th century. And, we talked a lot about the sacrifices that entailed. We talked about the story of Stalin and the tanks, about this sort of get it done no matter what the cost mentality of sort of dragging Russia into where it needed to be. And I think the point is that, the surprising thing with Stalin is not so much the atrocities that he had committed. We know the atrocities he committed. No one looks to Stalin as a paragon of virtue, as someone who you should want to imitate. But if you look at it strictly in terms of results, it is arguable that Stalin is successful, that Russia goes from a backwater that is predominantly agricultural to nuclear superpower, nearly defeating the United States in the Cold War in a matter of 20, 30 years. It's incredible if you think about it. And this is something that Stalin is successful at doing. Now, does that mean that we should praise Stalin? Of course not. That's sort of the whole point of the darkness at noon discussion that we had. However, it is fact, and it is undeniable that this thing happened. And briefly to mention darkness at noon, I don't want to go over the reveal about why we use darkness at noon as an educational tool. But Darkness at Noon is a book about how Stalin, quote, brings the country together by getting rid of his political rivals through the use of these show trials, through the use of these fake fictitious trials with trumped up evidence in order to get rid of people that did not support him at the NEP. This was done in order to have a sort of unified party. But moving back to Germany, we've been going back and forth between Russia and Germany for a while now. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about how the Weimar Republic, that is, brought forth by acclamation, as you can see here, all of these people that stayed home, that get rid of the Kaiser, the King of Prussia. How does this end up as a Nazi state? Well, we have to sort of divide this period of chaos in Weimar between three main camps. The first are the Weimar government and the people supporting the Weimar government, right? So you have all of these people that we spoke about with negative connotations in our Weimar lecture. But I mean, I think that a lot of that is Nazi propaganda to some extent, as was a lot of that lecture to get you to understand the viewpoint. The Weimar government, these are people that, by and large, opposed the war, wanted sort of Napoleon/Kerensky style reforms in Germany, but were not willing to go, full Lenin the way the far left and its supporters were willing to go. These at a fundamental level, the Weimar government and its supporters, they believe in democracy. They're not communists, but they also don't want a return to monarchic militarism. They're not fascists either. And they're sort of caught in the middle of this ideological divide between the far left and the far right. There's a throwaway line in Max where the general of the army is telling young Hitler that Germany is poised on a knife's edge. Will it fall to the left or will it fall to the right? And that's sort of what's happening, in Weimar, essentially, where you have this knife's edge and the two ideological extremes between which it is caught. And it may shock you to learn, but in the early days of the Weimar Republic, the bigger threat was not the far right, it was the far left. A far left that was galvanized by what had happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, look, think about it. This is before, while the debate around the NEP, surrounding the NEP is ongoing, the Trotskyists are still rather popular. I mean, look, if behind Lenin and Stalin, if I ask you name another communist, chances are you'll name Trotsky, because Trotsky has a rather sort of famous understanding of how the revolutionary politics should function. And because of that, because of people like Rubishov and Darkness at Noon, these far left movements are ascendant, essentially. Right? There you go. There's our old friend, Mr. Trotsky, right there. And this ends up manifesting in the German socialist movement. And the German socialists call themselves the Spartacist movement, named after Spartacus, the slave that took on Rome. And they're led by its two main leaders, shown here in these giant posters, Karl Kautsky and, more famously, Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg is really the leader of this movement. Kautsky is more of a moderate. Kautsky is more of a, I guess what we would now call a democratic socialist, essentially, in that he doesn't want revolution, but he also does not support the current government. And the two of these together, the more revolutionary Luxemburg and the more moderate Karl Kautsky, sort of, form this grand alliance in agreement that the Weimar Republic needs to go. Not that they don't support the Weimar government over the far right, but that they view the Weimar government as something that is extremely weak and that could fall in any moment. And because it can fall in any moment, the Weimar government represents an opportunity for the socialists more than a danger. And so you have this gigantic Spartacist movement that takes to the streets. And because the Spartacist movement is on the ascendancy, essentially the Weimar government, faced with its essentially impending collapse, because the far left is far more popular than it is. You have some people coming home from the war, and they face the exact sort of opposite dilemma that Junger has. Whereas Junger would have gone into the right, people like Remarque fell sort of smack in between the Weimar government and the far left. They agree with the Weimar government on principle, but they're unwilling to support it because, like the Jungers of the world, they also see the Weimar government as having betrayed the war effort, but they're also not willing to take up arms and do it again. And so they end up siding with the far left, as a rise of an alternative to democracy. I think what's fascinating in terms of class structure, before I tell you what happens here, is that if Unit 1 was about the collapse of feudalism, and Unit 2 is about the rise of democracy, well, then Unit 3, everything we've seen since World War I, has really been about the challenges to democracy in the early part of the 20th century, both from the far left in terms of the communist movement and the far right in terms of the fascist movements in Italy and in Germany and in Japan. That's what this unit has really been about, essentially, about how you have these people that are looking for an alternative to classic liberal style democracy for a variety of reasons. But essentially, in order to pursue its own survival, the far left attacks the Weimar government in what is called the Spartacist Revolt, I believe of 1924, but I may be mistaken on that. And in order to protect itself, the Weimar government seeks support from the far right. And the far right engages the far left on behalf of the Weimar government. And understand, when I say the far right engages the far left, I mean violently. This ends extremely poorly. You have a bunch of people who had maintained their army uniforms and their guns as part of these Freikorps that I mentioned a couple classes ago, who essentially shooting on unarmed protesters, on this mass movement of protesters. But here's the problem. In so doing, the Weimar government makes these far-right agitators the heroes of Germany, because they had saved the country from the communists. They had saved the government. Suddenly, these guys are not your people who cannot get over the war. These are the people that came to Germany in its time of need once more and saved the country. And so because of that, people like Hitler are praised as heroes. And this is where the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany emerges. Now, I want to be clear that the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany doesn't mean anything, because you can put words together, sure, but politically and ideologically, these words have no business going together. It's a lot like saying the Libertarian Democratic Republican Party of America. You could put the words together, but it doesn't mean anything, right? There's no such thing as a Libertarian Democratic Republican, because these words are oxymoronic with each other, in modern politics. But that's what Hitler does. And the idea is that when his small party goes out and says, we are the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, some person will identify with at least one of those words. Oh, I'm a nationalist. Oh, I'm a socialist. Oh, I'm a worker. Oh, I'm a German. Let me get in the door and see what these people are about. However, what the platform is not a platform that embodies any of these things. The platform is about radical anti-Semitism. Now, for today, I believe for next class, but you have to read a document in Stephen Bronner's A Rumor About the Jews. Here it is. You're reading copies from the same book. And in A Rumor About the Jews, Dr. Bronner, who, former professor of mine, for the record, just throwing that out there, argues that one of the foundational documents, in almost a parody of the Communist Manifesto, what the Communist Manifesto is to the socialist movement, you have this document, this pamphlet, and it's called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, please, 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 don't go Googling this document. This is a document that is still widely believed in by some pretty heinous folk. And by Googling it, you may end up on some websites that maybe might put you on a list. So don't do it. Don't. There are sections that I want you to read, and they're photocopied in here. So when you're going to use that document, please use this book instead, because there's a lot of sections in here in which it is discussed. Now, what are the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Well, for starters, it's not a real document. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are created by the Tsarist government, our old pal Nicholas II, in 1905, back when Lenin's brother was captured and killed, if you remember. And part of this was to sort of shift the blame for revolutionary fervor off of the Tsar and onto Jews, essentially. And it's a fake document in which the document claims, and it's not true, it is complete bullshit, it's not true, but the document claims to be minutes of a meeting that someone took of the, quote, Elders of Zion. Now, if you're a conspiracy-minded anti-Semitic right-winger, the Elders of Zion is rabbis, essentially, in which these rabbis are getting together and plotting to take over the world. I am not kidding. That is actually what this document is about. And, can't make this up if I tried. And like the manifesto, itty-bitty manifesto, small, pocketable, designed to be smuggled into factories and passed down the production lines. Similarly, this pamphlet does the same thing. And it sort of tickles the same anger and the same nerve that people might have. Where the Communist Manifesto says, yeah, your lives are terrible, and here's the reason why your lives are terrible. It's because, there's an economic system in which the wealthy classes, take advantage of the poorer classes. Well, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion make similar claims, only instead of being, it is the wealthy classes that are abusing you, it is the Jews that are abusing you. Now, obviously, again, bears repeating, this is not true. But as I mentioned in the Weimar class, it doesn't need to be true. It needs to feel true, right? Because people don't behave based on truth. People behave based on what they feel the truth is. And if they feel the truth is what is being told in this document, then they're going to listen to Hitler. Now, a couple of things happen. Adolf Hitler, with his newfound party, as we said, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, attempts to use his newfound popularity in the immediate aftermath of the Spartacus movement to hold what is called the beer house putsch. Now, the story that I'm about to describe is insane, but true story. So, in the early days of this political movement, the party was small enough to all fit in one bar, a beer house. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Approximately, 50, 60 people. You could tight fit, but you could fit them all in one big beer house. And so, as you do, all of the members of the party, including Mr. Hitler, get sloshed. They're completely just gone. Rutgers, New Brunswick on a Saturday night, just plastered. And being the conspiratorial Nazis that they were, drunk Nazis, including drunk Hitler, decide that they want to take over the government, as you do. And I don't know if you've ever been the sober friend in the group, those of you who are 21 plus, but getting a group of drunk people to do anything in an organized fashion is impossible. It's just not going to happen. Now, imagine if the thing you need these drunk people to do is take over the government. Clearly, this doesn't work. And for his efforts, Hitler is thrown in prison. And while he is in prison, a few things happen. Hitler is in prison for a good part of the 1920s for sedition, essentially. And while he's in prison, he distills all of the ideas that he has around militarism, around anti-Semitism, all of the ideas that are touched upon in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And he puts them all in a document. That document is, you may have heard of it, Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf roughly translates into my journey or my struggle. And unfortunately, Hitler's time in prison is used by Hitler to distill all of his ideas into, I don't want to say a cohesive or a cogent one, because that implies that they are correct. They are not correct, but they have an internal logic to them. There we go, right? So he is able to string together different parts of his political beliefs into one sort of organized understanding of the world. And that organized understanding of the world is, of course, one that we're familiar with. It is the cornerstone of what would become the Nazi movement. This idea that Aryanism is the superior race. This idea of racial politics and politics being an extension of racial dynamics, and how a good government should be actively engaging in these policies instead of engaging in what he would call bland liberalism. Now, again, and it bears repeating, none of these ideas are scientifically accurate. They're not the truth, but the truth does not matter. Remember what I said when I talked about the Weimar Republic, in our first lecture. If you're expecting these theories to be logical, then you won't get it. They're not supposed to be logical. Think back to Max, right? Anytime Hitler is challenged, Hitler, does not have a comeback. And so he will resort to this sort of raw sort of emotiveness. He will tell the men in the audience that Jews are coming for their daughters. He will never sort of engage rationally with the criticisms of what he's saying, because what he is saying is not rational. It is emotive. This was also arguably one of the mistakes in how the Weimar government and the left dealt with Hitler. They tried to, treat the man as being a rational sort of good faith actor, but that was not the case for what we're talking about. Instead, we're dealing with someone who is dealing with these issues on an emotive level. And when he comes back, the situation in Germany is worse than it was before, because the socialist movement is essentially leaderless. Rosa Luxemburg, during the Spartacus movement, is executed by a bunch of right-wingers, and her body is dumped in the river, rather famously and rather tragically. Because of that, the socialist movement is divided. The Weimar government is hopeless, has these hopeless problems with corruption. And part of the reasons why it has these hopeless problems with corruption is because of something we've looked at way back when in Unit 2. What are crises of capitalism again? Who remembers? YouTube chat and Zoom chat. What are crises of capitalism? Crises of what? Are they crises of shortage? Come on, y'all are here. Don't make me unmute your mics.
It was crises of having
crises of what? We looked at them.
I don't remember
what happens in 2007. Did we have too many houses or too few houses?
Too many.
Crises of capitalism are crises of abundance. We have too much stuff, so much stuff that we can't sell. And remember what I said in the class on Marx and on the Industrial Revolution. Part of the issue is that in, for example, the 1920s, the thing that was made too much of was these high-value consumer goods, fridges, ovens, washing machines. Remember this thing? We talked about it, right? Well, the 1920s in America and the Great Depression means that all of these banks are on the hook for all of this stuff. But here's the problem. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany has to pay back this enormous war debt that it cannot afford to pay. So what does it do? It goes to American banks. And it says, "Dear Mr. American Banks, sir, I know we just fought a war with each other, but I have to pay back your government. Can you please give me a loan? High interest doesn't matter. I need the money and I need it now." And so they get this money out of American banks, and they're slowly paying it off. But one day, when the financial crisis hits, 1920s, Great Depression, banks suddenly need a lot of money and they need it now. And so what do? They call back all the debts, including the ones to Germany. And Germany cannot pay it just as much as they couldn't pay it before. And so Germany makes a mistake that is so critical in their understanding of how the world works and how economics works, that it has given them a permanent fear of what I'm about to describe. Essentially, the German central bank and the panicking Weimar government get together and they just print enough money that they need to pay off the debt. And they take the money, they send it off to America. Now, what happens when you print a lot of money really quickly? Anyone know what this is called in economics? Any guesses? It's called inflation, right? Inflation. When you take a lot of money from your central bank and you print it super quick, you get inflation. But it's not just inflation, right? Because it's not that the German government took all of this money and printed it and then used it in its own economy. That's what causes inflation. the German government took all of this money and then shipped it overseas. It is the economic equivalent of printing all of this money, causing inflation, and then taking it behind the Capitol and burning it. And it causes something that is called stagflation. And it is the nightmare for economists, because what happens? You're in a depression because you have lost all of this money practically overnight, but also you're in an inflation. It's called stagflation. It is the nightmare. It is the thing that keeps the head of the Federal Reserve awake at night. Stagflation is extremely hard to get out of, because everything you would do to fix one problem makes the other problem worse, right? So in order to get rid of your depression, in order to get rid of your stagnation, you should print more money. But the more money you print, the worse your inflation gets. And in order to fix the inflation, you need to stop printing money, which means the worse your depression gets. It is a lose-lose scenario. And this is when Hitler comes out of prison, at the heart of this crisis. And Hitler says, aha, you see, I was right. I was right all along. Not only have the Jews taken over your politics, they've also made sure that the money in your wallet is completely worthless. Vote for me. Hitler goes from being a party that was getting between 2 and 5% of the vote to about 35% of the vote, almost overnight. And with his newfound popularity and the fact that the election of 1930, I want to say 32, is coming up, Hitler decides he's going to run for office. He's going to run for Chancellor of the German Republic. Sorry, not Chancellor, Prime Minister of the German Republic. Him and his party, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And so he loses the election. He's faced off against Hindenburg, the guy who made the Zeppelin, that Hindenburg. He's a war hero. He's popular, and he's a unity candidate. And yes, Hindenburg wins the election. But Hitler does a lot better than he should have, because bear in mind, this is a guy who is running on the, full-on anti-Semitic rhetoric, and he's getting between 30 and 40% of the vote. And this puts Hindenburg in a bit of a bind, because he cannot ignore Hitler anymore, because Hitler is a minority party, but he's a big minority party. And so in order to co-opt the movement, essentially, in order to protect himself from the far left, Hindenburg says, Hitler, would you like a job? And he makes Hitler Chancellor of the German Republic. He's not in charge, but he still has power. Now, to be clear, the Chancellor of the German Republic is a very administrative role. Chancellors of the German Republic essentially make sure that the roads are paved, that the sewage runs, all of the things that we expect the government to do, but are like the least glamorous things a government does. And Hitler is put in charge of these things. Now, I personally cannot think of a man worse suited for that sort of job. And in fact, Hitler hates it. But Hitler has a plan. Because the next year, the Reichstag building burns to the ground. The Reichstag building is the equivalent of the House of Congress, the Capitol building in the United States, in D.C., burns to the ground. And it is unclear who did it. Now, a socialist worker is captured, and he's blamed. It is said that he has done so in anger and frustration over the Spartacus, failure from a few years back. And so he had engaged in an act of political terrorism. It is unclear whether this is true or not. But remember, truth doesn't matter. And Hitler is able to, not necessarily frame, because for all we know, this is actually what happened. The truth is, we just don't know. But what Hitler is able to do is say, aha, you see, I was right. Enemies within, enemies without. There is a cabal of Jews and socialists that is out to come and get us. I need emergency powers in order to do my job. And he essentially grants them to himself, but Hindenburg does not say no. I think crucially, At this step, had Hindenburg told Hitler, no, you cannot do this, we would be talking about a very different history. But instead, Hitler grants himself sort of emergency overriding powers. And Hindenburg, an old, frail man at this point, dies. And after he dies, it's abundantly clear that there's not going to be another election in Germany. And just like that, Adolf Hitler becomes the Führer in a democratically elected one. In a democratic country, here's a far-right fascist taking control. This happens very quickly, too, to be clear. This happens over the course of 3.5 years between election time and Hitler being the Führer. And immediately, now that he has this sort of overriding absolute authority, now that Hindenburg is gone and he has absorbed Hindenburg's role into his own, suddenly he has all of the emergency powers that he gave himself, plus all the powers that Hindenburg has. He is de facto an absolute ruler. Now, there are 3 elements to Hitler's plan. Bear in mind, now that he has absolute control, Hitler can start to impose his agenda for Germany onto Germany. And so, I don't know, I know this is a little bit blurry here, but the first thing that Hitler does is he targets the social institutions of Germany. Now, what I would ask you is, what would you say the most important social institution in your life is? Like the thing in your life that is the most important as a sort of a societal institution. What do you think it is? Don't make me call on you guys. Come on, participate. What do you think? All right, well, I guess I'll call on people. Megan, what do you think? Hello?
I'm not sure.
Oop.
Can you hear me?
Talk now. I had it on.
I just said I'm not sure.
Hello?
Can you hear what I'm saying?
Crickets. Okay. Well, according to Hitler, at least, the most important social institution is the family. Hold up. Who this? Chat. Oh, my mic isn't working for some reason. Okay. All right. The most important social institution, according to Hitler at least, is the family. The family is the most important thing, right? It is the most important thing in your life, in my life, in most people's lives. And so Hitler thinks, arguably correctly, although, awful what he does, but arguably correctly, that if Hitler can reshape the family in his image, in the image of what he wants the family to look like, well then, he can reshape Germany. And so, he sets up the marriage laws, the famous Nuremberg laws, the year after he comes to power. Now, the Nuremberg laws codify into law a couple of things. For starters, it legally defines who a Jew is. And according to the laws, you were Jewish if you had at least 2 grandparents that were Jewish. So let's say your paternal grandfather and your maternal grandmother are both Jewish. Congratulations, you're Jewish too. Here's the thing. The marriage laws are implemented at this point. Just a second, let me back out of it. Oh, that also works. All right. The marriage laws are also implemented around this time. So what does that mean? Essentially, it means that Jews and Germans, because the Jews were German, bears mentioning quite a lot, but cannot intermarry anymore. And this is a big step in how Hitler can reshape the family. Because in his mind, A family looks like this: working father, stay-at-home mother, many, 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 many children. If you believe, like Hitler does, in Aryan supremacy, then the goal is to turn Germany into essentially a factory that can produce as many Aryan children as humanly possible. And in order to do that, he needs to, for starters, implement these marriage laws, right? There is no more intermarrying. And if you were married before, you are no longer married. I think that's the big one. That's the thing that people often remember about this period of time. People that were married were forced to get divorces, essentially. But the new government sets up these commandments. And these commandments are really illustrative for what Hitler wants the family to look like. So when you're choosing your spouse, remember that you're a German, so only marry Germans. If you are of sound stock, do not remain unwed. If you're healthy, if you're young, don't stay single. Your job and your duty to your country is to make children, to make babies. Keep your body pure. Keep your spirit and soul pure. As a German, choose someone of German or Nordic blood for your partner. When choosing your spouse, look into their lineage. Health is a precondition of external beauty. If you die young, you can't have children, so you need to stay healthy. Marry only out of love. This is one of those throwaway lines in there. Seek not a playmate, but a partner in a marriage. And of course, wish for as many children as possible. Now, this is where the camp system starts. But who's heard of the story of the frog in the pot of boiling water, right? If you take a pot of, awful, atrocious experiment that it's used as a metaphor, but this is not exactly how the metaphor goes. But the metaphor says that if you take a pot of boiling water and you throw a frog in there, the frog will get in the boiling water and immediately jump out because the water's boiling. But if you take a frog and you put it in a pot of cold water and then slowly, slowly, slowly up the heat, the frog will stay in there until it boils alive. Because people do not recognize escalation. And so the concentration camp starts here. Not for Jews, to be clear, but for people that do not fit this model of what the family looks like. So let's ask the uncomfortable questions. Who doesn't fit this model? Who does not fit the model of Hitler's view for the family? Think about it. There's a pretty obvious one, right? If Hitler believes that the whole purpose of the family is to have as many children as possible, then there's one glaring thing there that obviously can't have children. About people who are sterile, women who can't have babies, or men whose swimmers don't work, right? We need to not only not allow them to marry, we need to get rid of them actively. And so the camp systems are born. And these are not so much concentration camps as they are experimentation camps. But of course, it goes beyond that. Homosexuals are also sent to these camps. People with, not to kink shame, but people with weird, or not weird, but out of the ordinary sexual wants, right? People who are overly promiscuous, especially women who are overly promiscuous in Nazi Germany. People who have disabilities, physical or mental. All of these people must be not only isolated, they must be removed according to Hitler's marriage laws. And because of that, they are sent to, how could I forget, other members of the LGBT community. Trans people are also, cross-dressers, also included in this list. And they are sent to these early camps. These early camps are where the horror stories come from, because they are not so much concentration camps as they are experimentation camps, in that the German government wanted to figure out, quote, what was wrong with these people. And so This is where the doctors are sent. This is the horror story. These are horror story camps. These are the ones that you sort of know about and you hear about, but you never really look into because you don't want the nightmare fuel. That's what these camps are. But slow escalation. And many people say nothing. Bear in mind, this is not 2020. This is 1930. It's not considered socially acceptable to be out, for example. And so because of that, a lot of people's reactions to openly homosexual people being sent to a camp is, honestly, and it pains me to say it, good riddance. A lot of people who are trans and are sent to these camps, a lot of the majority of Germans who are not willing to accept these people as people say, I see no problem with this. And that's the problem, and it's a slow escalation. Slow escalation, because we then enter the second phase, the rather more famous phase of Hitler's view for Germany. Oh, sorry. Let's quickly recap here. Hitler's goal is to change society. In order to do so, he has to begin with the family. And so here is a poster of the idealized Nazi family. As you see, working father, stay-at-home mother, multiple children. Again, the goal for the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany is to create in Germany a factory that will pump out German babies, Aryan babies. The goal is to, in his mind at least, create the Übermensch. Who's heard of, I don't know, maybe some of you have taken philosophy at MCC, but when you look at Nietzsche talks a lot about this fictionalized version of the superhuman, the Übermensch, the man over all else. But where Nietzsche was talking figuratively, Hitler believes that this is a real attainable thing, and he wants to achieve that through essentially eugenics, into some deeply disturbing and troubling views on race and on women in particular. And those who don't fit with this idea must be removed in Hitler's view. Well, let's talk about the second aspect of Hitler's view for Germany, and that is what he calls the Jewish question. Now, again, people seem to think that Hitler starts in fourth gear and says, okay, concentration camps for everyone. This is not accurate. This is not the case. The Jewish question begins with the implementation of ghettos. Now, ghettos as a legal and policy concept. Now, a little moderate history lesson here. Jewish ghettos and Jewish neighborhoods had existed for centuries in Europe, and they emerged because of a rather practical reason. Every Saturday, those of you who are Jewish and are listening to this can attest to this, most every Saturday, Jews go to temple, right? And so in an era before cars, before bicycles, and before horses were readily available to most people, many Jews wanted to live within walking distance of their temple. Not because of, not so much because of the neighborhoods were good, but because of convenience, right? You wanted to be able to walk to the place you have to go to every Saturday, which means that over the course of centuries, many Jewish people tended to live in the same neighborhood, in the same sort of couple mile radius from their temple. This is how Jewish neighborhoods begin, and some of them are now rather famous. Paris has a rather famous one called La Marais, or the Swamp, because it used to be in a swampy area of Paris that then got refurbished essentially. But the concept there is the same. Essentially, Hitler says these sort of informal neighborhoods, no, we're going to formalize that division. We're going to set up walls and checkpoints going in and out of these Jewish ghettos. And if you live in the Jewish ghetto, you cannot leave the Jewish ghetto. All Jewish businesses must be found in the Jewish ghetto. All Jewish anything must be found in the Jewish ghetto. Essentially, they're open air, sectioned off areas of major German cities that are turned into open-air prisons, essentially. But again, most people say nothing because, oh, well, I mean, they're already with their own friends anyway, their own people. What would it matter if it's a legal or non-legal distinction? But of course, it matters quite a bit if it's legal or not legal, right? But most Germans don't think that. And so again, pot's slowly boiling. Many Jews living in these ghettos say, okay, I mean, look, I live here anyway. Nothing really changes for me. The thing that Hitler wants in so doing is to reduce the German population by attrition. Essentially, that if Jews can't get married because they're separate from one another, then there will be fewer Jewish children. And if there are fewer Jewish children and there are more German babies because of the way he views the family, then eventually there will be no more Jews in Germany. This is how Hitler views the policy. There's more on this if you take, MCC has a genocide studies course that either I or Dr. Corrigan tend to teach. That is very, very good, and I highly recommend it. Shameless plug, take the one with me, of course. Not to say Dr. Corrigan's is bad. Terry's a really good instructor. But what ends up happening is that Hitler is unsatisfied with how slow the progress is. And so he comes up, the Jewish question, he goes to his government and says, make this happen faster. And so the idea of self-deportation is implemented. Now, parentheses, you may remember a while back in 2012, Governor Romney running for president got in a lot of trouble for using similar language. Exactly for this reason. He was referring to, during the primary that year, he's referring to people who are undocumented. But he got in trouble for using that phrase specifically because that phrase specifically was used by Hitler in this context to get Jews to want to leave Germany. And for those of you that are reading Eichmann in Jerusalem right now, you will know that Eichmann's first job in the Nazi Party is as a facilitator of this. More on that next week. But essentially the idea is, what if we make living conditions within these ghettos so awful and so atrocious that many of these Jews will want to leave of their own volition? So let's stop collecting trash in the Jewish ghettos. Let's cut off the water. Let's cut off the power. Let's make sure that the sewage pipes are stopped up so the whole ghetto smells of raw sewage. Let's send in SS thugs in disguise to go in there and smash up Jewish businesses and harass, often sexually harass, Jewish women, and make people so scared to want to stay in Germany that they will leave of their own accord. There is, of course, a major flaw in this thinking, because a bunch of SS members going into these ghettos and harassing people and say, you don't belong here, go home. Well, these people were home. Yeah, they were Jews, but they were German Jews. This is the only country that they had ever known. And, remove, as hard as it is, remove the Jewish element from this. How hard would the situation in this country need to be for you to willingly leave your home, for you to become a refugee? I would guess pretty bad, right? It would take an act of God for you to want to willingly elect to leave your home, the place you had lived in your whole life. And many do. I want to be clear. Many do. Many, especially those who escaped the Holocaust, this is right around the time when they leave. Many of them come to this part of the world, specifically here in New Jersey and in New York and the Northeast of the United States more generally. Many go, embrace the burgeoning Zionist movement and go to Israel, to what is now Israel. Many escape to other countries in Europe, and that escape would not last very long, as World War II will begin. But the fact is that much like the ghetto system before it, the self-deportation system does not have results that are acceptable to Hitler. And so Hitler goes to his advisors. For the record, this is known as, this sort of view of how genocides happen is called the institutionalist or the functionalist view of genocide. Again, take my genocide class, in which the person at the top is essentially saying, you need to do this faster. And then you have a bunch of government employees getting together and said, like, oh my God, if I want to get promoted, I need to find another way to do this. And it's sort of, they sort of back into what ends up being the final solution. More on that in a minute. And so the concentration camp system is implemented. Now, why is it implemented? Well, think about it. We already have the system that we were using for the experimentation camps. So we already know that it is successful model. And I mean, functionally speaking, I am disgusted at myself for talking like this. I want to make it clear. Well, what if we take the ghetto and then we take the camp and combine the two and essentially make what is a Jewish ghetto, but outside of the city? And if people are not having children in these concentration camps, there will be no more Jewish babies. Problem solved. Problem solved. And so that's how the concentration camp system starts, as a slow escalation. They're moved into the concentration camps. And this is right around the latter half of the 1930s, 1937, 38. But if you know anything about history, 1939, something rather important happens. Something rather important happens. So this transitions rather nicely into Hitler's foreign policy. This is the third major plank we're going to discuss today about Hitler. Hitler's foreign policy is about getting as much as should be German into Germany. Remember our discussion about nationalism as a question, about where is Germany, about how that's not clear because the borders of Germany change constantly. Well, Hitler is of the opinion that any land in which Germany is spoken should be part of Germany. And it starts with Germany's neighbors to the south, Austria. So you see here in this map, unfortunately, I could not find an English version of this map, so we'll have to make do with German. But roughly you can get a sense of what this is. To the south of the Deutsches Reich is Österreich, which is Austria. Now Austria speaks German, and so what does Hitler do? Hitler has people who are affiliated with the Nazi Party in Austria call for a referendum to join Hitler's Germany. And while the voting is going on, Hitler marches his army south and places it on the border, making it abundantly clear what's going to happen. Vote yes and join Germany peacefully, or vote no and join Germany not so peacefully. And sure enough, the Austrians vote yes, and they join Germany. No bloodshed. Now, of course, this is, extremely sketchy. Let's just call it that. And the Allies, or the future Allies at least, specifically in Germany and in France, they get together and say, oh, well, he's not allowed to do this, but here he is doing it anyway. He's also not allowed to have an army because that's supposed to be disbanded after World War I, but he has one anyway. What do we do? This is where, if you've heard of Chamberlain before, you may have heard of the policy of appeasement. And appeasement is a disastrous policy that especially the British take. Especially the British take in dealing with Hitler, where essentially they say, if we give Hitler this one thing, maybe he'll calm down. Maybe he'll leave us alone. The reality is that that's not how Hitler viewed it. Hitler says, okay, you'll give me this other thing, you give me this thing, so now I want this other thing. The more appeasement happened, the more Hitler demanded. And we go from Austria to the Sudetenland of November of the same year. If the Anschluss of Austria happens in March of 1938, the Sudetenland happens in November of 1938. Now, the Sudetenland are, if you see here, in the sort of armpit of Germany, all of these darker shaded blue lands along the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. Well, one of these days, in November of 1938, Hitler takes his tanks and marches right into the Sudetenland and just takes them. They speak German there. And then in March of the next year, he takes the rest of the province of Bohemia, which is this lighter shaded blue here, of March of 1939. And of September of that same year, Hitler invades Poland, attempting to reunify East and West Prussia, starting World War II. But of course, let's go back to our previous problem. Here's a picture of the Anschluss before we move on, that I find rather fascinating. This is Austria. This is Vienna, with decked out with Nazi memorabilia. This leaves Germany in a, whoops, one sec, let's go back here. Sorry about that, guys. Play on this Mac. There we go. This leaves Germany in a bit of a bind because essentially the Department of War and the Department of, quote, the Jewish question, both have extreme costs in maintaining both the cost of a war and the cost of the concentration camp system. Bear in mind, the concentration camp system is incredibly expensive. And the number of Jews being sent into the concentration camp system is increasingly expanding as more territories in Europe are being conquered and more of their Jews are sent into concentration camps. And pair that with, over the course of the war, Italy and Mussolini essentially surrendering their Jews to Hitler. What does this mean? Well, with the prospect of impending bankruptcy, essentially, because they're going to run out of money trying to do both, Hitler is faced with a choice: end the war or end the concentration camp system. And he decides for the latter. And when you have too many assets and you're overextended, there's one thing you can do, and that is liquidate. And so Hitler decides to liquidate every single Jew in the concentration camp system. This is done at a conference, the minutes of which you had to read for today, the minutes of the Wannsee Conference. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference is arguably the most boring reading of the course, by my own admission. It's extremely boring. It is minutes of a conference of essentially German public policy people, middle managers, trying to find out, decide how to square the budget loophole, the circle of, square the circle of, the budget of the German Reich. And when no options are found, all of these bureaucrats, worried for their own careers and looking to save their own skins, condemn millions and millions of Jews to their deaths. And they do so in what is considered to be the most cost-effective way possible. Not in mass shootings. Bullets are needed for the war effort. And instead, gas is used because gas is cheap, because gas can, a single canister of gas can be used to kill a large number of Jewish German Jews. Sometimes individual camp administrators took it a step further. They would do is they would load a whole truckload of Jews onto a truck. They would take the exhaust and add a pipe to it and pipe back into this sort of covered capsule in the back. They would drive to the mass grave. By the time the truck had arrived at the mass grave, all the Jews in the back of the truck were dead. Again, designed to be cost effective. And this is one of the realities of the Reich. I mean, there is no beating around that bush. Now, I will mention this again next week, on Thursday when we talk about Eichmann. But as sort of an educational tool. I don't really, because the Holocaust is discussed so well and so effectively as part of American pop culture, that I don't necessarily need to explain the mechanics of the Holocaust more than I already have. What instead we're going to do is we're going to look at the Holocaust through the lens of one man, and that man being Adolf von Eichmann. And we're going to do so next week. Now, you should be reading Eichmann in Jerusalem for next week, and the reaction paper will be due before the lecture on Wednesday night. And because of that, on Tuesday, there will be no lecture. Tuesday is a reading day. Tuesday, there's no work for Tuesday. Please take that time to read Eichmann in Jerusalem. I know that it is not the most interesting thing you'll ever read. However, the Eichmann trial is perhaps the most fascinating thing that I teach, that I've ever taught, ever. And I look forward to discussing that with you. So, please take this weekend and please take next week, the week between our lectures, to discuss amongst yourselves and with your family the question of Eichmann, because it's an interesting question, and I look forward to having it with you. Again, this is some of the hardest stuff that we're going to talk about in this class, and I understand that for many of you this may have been a lot. I try not to teach this stuff in a sort of watered down fashion, because I feel like it does it a disservice to discuss it in any other way but bluntly. But if you're having trouble with the material for today, I completely understand. Feel free to email me, and I'm happy to talk about it with you. Okay. On a personal note, I hope you guys are doing better than this week than you were last week. Teaching in quarantine is hard. I can't imagine what it's like for your other classes, but I remain confident that we will pull through this. And I hope to be teaching in person soon, but who knows? All right, guys. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe out there. And if you are teaching online, if you're working this weekend, if you're a essential employee, I'm really sorry you have to do this, but I respect you. I appreciate you. Thank you. All right, guys. I will see you guys next week. Enjoy your weekend. Bye. And meet.